Good morning. This is Wendi Secrist, Executive Director of the Workforce Development Council. I wanted to provide an update in advance of next week's council meeting on the work that a number of our committees have been doing around the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Over the past 6 months, we've updated a number of policies and want to give you a high-level overview of those policies. You'll have a copy of all of them in addition to this recording. So if you want to read through them and ask me any questions, I would love to have a dialogue with you. And if there's anything in those policies that you would like to ask the committees to reconsider or take a deeper look at, we're also open to that as well. But because of the cancellation of our April council meeting and timing on some of these policies, we needed to work through both the committees and the executive committees to get them in place over the past 6 months. So I am going to get my technology to work and get to the next slide here. There we go. Just as a refresher, WIOA we are the state and local workforce board under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and we have a number of different responsibilities. I've got a few slides that'll give you a high-level overview of those. In Idaho, there are 6 core partner programs under WIOA, and they're concentrated into 4 different agencies. So Idaho Department of Labor has 4 of the programs: the Adult Dislocated Worker Youth and the Wagner-Pizer Employment Service Program. Idaho Career and Technical Education has the Adult Ed and Family Literacy Program. And then the Division of Vocational Rehab and Commission for the Blind and Visually Impaired oversee the vocational rehab programs in Idaho. We are responsible for coordinating across those programs along with other required partner programs, which are distributed throughout CTE, Department of Labor, the Community Council of Idaho, the tribes, the Commission on Aging, Health and Welfare, and others. So our job, while we don't necessarily oversee all of the money that goes through these different programs, is to provide that high-level coordination, strategic planning, making sure that continuous improvement and best practices and so forth are being used throughout the system. So we have a big role in overseeing this system, which means we have to have policies in place that guide how the system works together, along with our state plan. So next, I want to talk a little bit about the state board versus local board structure. WIOA requires that there be a state workforce board and local workforce development boards. Most states have a state board and then have multiple local workforce boards. In Idaho, we operate a little bit differently. Technically, we do have 2 local workforce areas. So we have the Region 6 Eastern Idaho area, which is one of our designated local workforce areas. And then we have what's called the balance of state, and that's the northern, north central, southwest, south central, and southeastern areas that you see on this map. So we have 2 local areas. As the state council, the Workforce Development Council, we are the local board for the balance of state. The local board for Eastern Idaho, for the Eastern region, actually lies with ESIPTA, the East Central Idaho Planning and Development Administration, and they delegate their responsibilities to the Workforce Development Council as a local board through an MOU. And then the U.S. Department of Labor recognizes that the state board can perform the duties of the local board under a waiver. And so that's how we operate as a single state workforce board, because we have the MOU in place that provides the one board delegating responsibility to the other board, and then U.S. Department of Labor allowing the state board to act as the local board. And that was put in place in 2005 by Governor Kempthorne to help reduce the amount of administrative funds that were going to operate these programs. They wanted to see more money going out to participants and less money in staffing and administration. And so that's a structure that we have had for quite a while. Regardless of how we operate, we have to follow USDOL's rules in how the funding flows from the federal level to the Idaho Department of Labor as the state administrative entity, and then to the 2 local boards. And the US Department of Labor was in visiting Idaho in January and identified, they issued what's called a finding to us, and identified that the process that Idaho had been using since the implementation of WIOA in 2014 was not documented correctly. And so we've put a policy in place to outline how that funding has to flow. And I'm going to go into quite a bit more detail on that in a few slides. So our functions as a state workforce board are really around setting that framework at the state level and strategy, planning, making sure that the state has workforce labor market information to be making good decisions. We're responsible for accountability and program oversight, continuous improvement, making sure that there's a technology infrastructure that can support the workforce system at the state level. So that's really our role with the state workforce board. At the local level, a lot of the same things. We're responsible for strategy and making sure that there's coordination among local stakeholders and employers, but we're also responsible for implementation at the local level. And that's where we select service providers. We make sure that the local barriers and to employment are broken down, and that the workforce is being matched to local employer needs. And that the coordination with the education system is functioning very, very well. Also responsible for making sure that the one-stop centers are accessible to all individuals. So the policies that we've been working on over the last 6 months are broken out on this slide by committee, and then whether they're a state or a local workforce board policy. And so the majority of the policies under WIOA are the responsibility of our one-stop committee. However, we have strategically given the eligible training provider policy to the policy committee, and that policy acts as both a state and a local policy. In other states, the state would have their policy that would set the guidelines for what the local policies could do, and then the local boards would have to adopt a policy under that. Well, we combined them into one. So we're setting our expectations and outlining our policy in the same document. The reason that we have the policy committee work on that is because they're also responsible for the workforce development training funds, and we want alignment in that. We wouldn't want, the training funds, looking at priorities in one area and the WIOA dollars, addressing different priorities with respect to alignment to in-demand occupations and training our workforce. So we like that the policy committee, gets to see both of those. In this recent update to the ETP policy, the main things that we had to update were laying out the process by which providers can appeal a decision on whether their program can be added to the eligible training provider list. That was something that was a little unclear. In the policy, the original policy indicated they could either take it to the Department of Labor's Appeals Bureau or to the Workforce Development Council. And since the Department of Labor actually implements the policy for us, we wanted to make it very clear that they go to the Department of Labor, it goes through the appeals process, and then the decisions get made that way. Because we wouldn't, if the policy wasn't being followed, then that would be addressed by the Department of Labor. If the policy needed to be changed, then that would be addressed by the council. So we've separated the mechanism on how those appeals are handled. The other thing that we did was add some significant definitions in an appendix to occupational skills training, basic skills training, post-secondary credentials, measurable skills gain. Those were words that are used throughout WIOA that are kind of fuzzy words, and people aren't really sure, well, is this a post-secondary credential? Does this fall under occupational skills training or basic skills training? And so we went through a number of different guidance documents from U.S. Department of Labor and others and tried to bring some of that together in definitions to just help guide the folks that are delivering the services on the ground as to what falls into what categories and what's acceptable under the policy. The other piece to eligible training provider, which you're going to be looking at next week, is what we call Appendix A, and it's our in-demand occupation methodology. And the policy itself tasks the policy committee with updating Appendix A annually in July. And so they'll be bringing that update to you, and we'll explain what's changed in there. But that's the piece of the policy that says, in order to be on the eligible training provider list, your training must lead to a job in these areas. So we'll see that next week. Okay, the next policies under the one-stop committee, the American Job Center certification policy and assessment criteria, again, is a state and local policy. In other states, you'd have a state level guidance document, and then you'd have local policies. We do that one in one. Our AJC policy, it sets the expectations for the level of service that's provided in the job centers. We mainly updated the process by which that was done. The original version of the policy was a little bit clunky in how centers were approved and who was responsible for doing what. And so we went in and having gone through the process over this past year, clarified and streamlined things to make it a little bit easier. We also updated the process on how they become certified and the context behind the criteria, so that if the expectation is that they are accessible to to individuals with disabilities, what does that mean? What standard are we expecting them to follow, and what are we referencing when we say that? So we tried to tie some of that type of clarity and detail into the policy. The next area is 3 different state board policies, and these were policies that were originally enacted in 2014, 2015 when WIOA was being implemented. The first one was that we had to have a policy that shows how we designate local workforce development areas. So like I said, we've got 2 local workforce development areas. Well, if a part of the state wanted to become their own workforce development area, they have the right to request that. And we have to have a policy in place that outlines how they would make that request. So that policy, number one, we needed to update it based on our new structure under the governor's office, and we needed to add some clarity as to what the requirements of becoming a local area are and what their responsibilities would be if they became a local area. So we basically just aligned that to the law. The other aspect of this policy is there was a criteria in there that really wouldn't have been defendable under a challenge. It had to do with, if a new local area wanted to be established, that it couldn't take funding from any of the other local areas. And that's just not possible because of the way WIOA is written and funds are distributed. So we decided that, it being something that's not defendable and not really in line with the law, because the law says a local area should be able to request to be designated, we took it out of the policy. The next one is the appointment and certification of local workforce boards. This is just if a new local area were certified, then how would we as the state board certify that they met the requirements for their local board? And this was mainly just updating it to our new structure and aligning it exactly to the requirements in WIOA as to what local board membership has to look like. We were able to take a policy that was put in place in 2016 and archive it. It was a policy that they required in the transition to WIOA as to how the state identified regions, but they have since integrated that into the state planning process. So every time we submit our state plan, we are identifying our regions in that process. So we went ahead and archived that policy. On the local board policies, we needed to go back and update that MOU between Region 6, between ISIPTA and the balance of state, to reflect the changes in the council. So that document had been put in place in 2005. It referred to the Workforce Investment Act, which is the previous version of WIOA. And it certainly didn't reflect our new structure. And so we did a complete rewrite of that MOU, and the ISIPTA board has approved that MOU, and the executive committee approved having me sign that. So now we have an updated document in place as to how we delegate those responsibilities between the two local boards, and then are able to act as a single state board. The next policy is probably the biggest one. This was a brand new policy for us, and this is the one that explains how the money is distributed from the federal level all the way down to the service delivery areas. And this is the one that I mentioned earlier. The U.S. Department of Labor issued a finding that we weren't, that they weren't following the process quite correctly. At the end of the day, I'll tell you that the dollars were correct. It was the formula that they went through when the allocations were being calculated that was not accurate. So while Idaho had been not in compliance from the standpoint of process, the outcome, the funds were being distributed, the correct amounts were being distributed each year correctly by the Department of Labor. So it was just one of these things that, you know, we'll get a policy in place, and we'll make sure that we're doing it accurately moving forward. So that policy, one of our goals with that was that there be complete transparency in how that funding flows and how it aligns with WIOA. And so I've got a couple of visuals on the next few slides that I'm going to walk you through to show you how the money flows, because it's important that you know, as council members know that. This last bullet is on the archiving transfer of funds between adult and dislocated worker programs. We integrated that into the distribution policy. So that got taken care of, and we were able to archive it. So let me talk a little bit about how the funds flow. So money comes to Idaho from the U.S. Department of Labor in 3 buckets, in the adult, dislocated worker, and youth buckets. And every year we get a grant. Just for the purpose of this conversation, you know, we're going to say $2 million goes into each of those 3 buckets. That gets distributed to the Idaho Department of Labor because they are the state's administrative entity. The governor has identified that the Department of Labor received the funds as the grantee. Then the Department of Labor has to turn those funds into local area, over to the local areas. So they get distributed from the state level to the 2 local areas. And then because of our policy and because of the way we operate, we actually further distribute that down to what we call the service delivery areas. So the local area 6, the other local board, is one of the 6 service delivery areas. And on the map on the previous, you know, earlier in this slide deck, you saw the 6 service delivery areas. And then within the balance of state, we have the other 5. So when that money comes to the state, the Department of Labor has the opportunity to reserve up to 15% of the entire grants. So of each of the buckets, they can reserve up to 15% for what's called a governor's reserve, and that funds certain statewide activities and technology investments and other things. And the money that comes to the council to operate the state workforce board and pays for part of our staff and part of our, and the council meeting expenses, comes out of that governor's reserve. So that governor's reserve is typically around $1 million. I'm trying to remember the exact numbers for this year, but you know, somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 million. And we see about 145 of that transfer into our operating budget to operate the council. But then the remainder of the funds are used to to run the state's labor exchange system, to do labor market research, to do all sorts, there's a list of activities that have to be done using that governor's reserve. They can also hold back up to 25% of the dislocated worker bucket for what's called rapid response. So if we see, mass layoffs, they are able to withhold some of those funds to be able to direct them to the mass layoffs rather than having them just go out by formula statewide and then possibly not having funding available if something unanticipated happens. So they can take those two pieces out, and they do, and very appropriately reserve those two funding lines, and then the balance of it goes to the local grants. So from there, we see each of those buckets go into the local area 6 and the local area balance of state buckets. Then as the local workforce board, we have the ability to take some set-asides out for what are called local service activities. So we are required to pay to fund a one-stop operator to coordinate programs across the different providers in the system. And so we have to take that out of the local service activities. We can also do labor market research. We can do other types of special projects with that. And I'll show you what we're doing for this new program year. But we would take our set-asides out, and then the remainder of those funds go to the service delivery areas. So it goes to the local area 6 service delivery area, and then to the balance of state. And in the balance of state, then we further divide it between the 5 service delivery areas. So for program year 20, which is just started on July 1st, based on our policy, what we have put in place for our local area activities is that we have to have the one-stop operator contract, and that is in the amount of $150,000, and you can just see in this table how it breaks out across the different programs, and then how much of it gets charged to the local area balance of state and local area 6. So we're doing the math, and we're tracking it all the way through the different programs. And I say we, I mean, this is the Department of Labor as the administrative entity that does all of these calculations for us and make sure that we're following the law. But the one-stop operator contract, we set aside $150,000 for that. We set aside $75,000 for workforce surveys. We're working with a nuclear consortium in Eastern Idaho right now to identify there's the potential for having 5,000 construction folks out on the site in 2024. And it's about a 15-year project timeline that has anywhere between 1,000 and the peak is at 5,000 in 2024. And so we're working on identifying what the training needs are going to be and what the impacts are going to be to the community and infrastructure and the existing employers and so forth. So having some money to be able to do that type of work is important for us. So that's just one of the projects that would fit under there, but I wanted to give you an example. We're setting aside $80,000 for promotion of apprenticeship. That'll be something that we'll have to procure a contractor to do that for us. But registered apprenticeship is super important to us and super important to WIOA, and we need to make sure that we've got somebody some entity that is working with our high schools, with our young adults and others, and really promoting apprenticeship on the ground with them. We have budgeted in some money for transition planning, about $35,000. And what that is we have to go out to bid for the adult and dislocated worker programs this program year. So if there were to be a change in the service provider, we would need to provide some funds to the new service provider next May and June so that they can start to get ready to take over services on July 1. And this is a very normal thing for boards to plan for. And so we've got that $35,000 in there as a contingency if we end up changing service providers. And then the last item is the local administrative entity delegated duties. We delegate all of our responsibilities and monitoring and doing the fiscal management, and all of that gets delegated to the Department of Labor. They have the staff and the capacity to do that. And so we are able as a local board to set aside up to 10% to cover that type of thing. And that's what we've set aside here for the local administrative entity. And then from there, the money flows to once those set-asides are taken out, the rest of the money flows to the service delivery areas. So I would be happy to walk you through any of these in a phone call or in person. They are complicated, but they are incredibly necessary, and I feel really good about the level of transparency that we have now in how we are distributing the funds, and making sure that we're accounting for all of the things that we're responsible for doing. I think this is a huge stride forward for the council and our partners. So any questions, please send them my way, and I will be happy to talk through them with you. The last thing that I wanted to do was just give you a quick update on the service provider selection. So we have been through the process of the one-stop operator. We used what's called an invitation to negotiate process, and hopefully next week I'm going to be able to announce we're in the final stages. It has to, the apparent winner they have to post it for appeals, but we're pretty much done with that one. So we'll have our one-stop operator in place hopefully by next week during the council meeting. Our adult and dislocated worker providers, I'll be starting to work on that. It'll also use the invitation to negotiate process. I'll start to work on the scope of work for that as soon as our budget gets turned in September, and with the idea that we get that procurement out late October, early November, have the responses in by the holidays. I don't want to make anybody have to write proposals over Christmas and New Year's. I think that's mean. So if we can get them in prior to the holidays, then we'll have January, February, March to work through them, do the negotiations, have somebody selected in April, and then if there is going to be a transition, that gives 2 months of transition time. And then we'll have to do another procurement for that apprenticeship outreach piece. So that is my WIOA update. Look forward to hearing from you if you have any questions. And as I said, with any of these policies, if you read through them and you have a concern or you want a committee to take another look at it, please let us know. We would be happy to do so. But it's been a long process to get all of these updated, but we're happy to have made so much progress. We have more to do, but we got a good chunk of it out of the way. So thank you very much.